She was a decorated Los Angeles police detective. She hunted killers for a living. She earned medals, commendations, respect from her peers. But for over 2 decades, Detective Stephanie Lazarus carried a secret. One that, if revealed, would shatter everything she had built. Because the truth was unthinkable, the woman trusted to solve murders had committed one herself. The story begins in the mid-1980s, Los Angeles, a city already notorious for crime, gang violence, and a police force under constant scrutiny. Stephanie Lazarus seemed like one of the bright spots in the LAPD. She was young, ambitious, and dedicated. A UCLA graduate, she joined the department in 1981 and quickly carved a reputation as reliable and tough. She specialized in art theft cases, later becoming known as one of the department's go-to experts. Her colleagues described her as charismatic, athletic, and disciplined. She was also deeply woven into the culture of the department. A cop's cop, someone who lived and breathed the badge. But behind the polished surface of her career, there was another story unfolding. One that revolved not around justice, but jealousy. Not around solving crime, but committing it. Meet Sherry Rasmussen. She was everything Lazarus wasn't, at least in Lazarus's eyes. Sherry was a bright, compassionate nursing director at a hospital in Los Angeles. She was warm, optimistic, and naturally empathetic. The kind of person people trusted instantly. Her colleagues adored her, her patients admired her, and her family considered her a shining light. And in 1985, Sherry was newly married to a man named John Ruetten. That name mattered more than anything. Because years before Sherry entered John's life, Stephanie Lazarus had been there. John and Stephanie had met back at UCLA. They shared a love for athletics, particularly water polo, and their relationship, while not always serious, was close. They had been on again, off again through college and beyond. But to Stephanie, it was more than just casual. She invested deeply in John. She wrote him letters. She took vacations with him. She pictured a future with him. So when John met Sherry, fell in love, and within a short time became engaged, Stephanie's world cracked. She confided in friends, admitting she was devastated. She even showed up uninvited at John's home, confronting him about his decision. And, chillingly, she also confronted Sherry. Imagine this moment. You're Sherry Rasmussen, newly married, hopeful for the future, and a uniformed LAPD officer shows up at your workplace, your husband's ex-girlfriend. Stephanie Lazarus reportedly told Sherry that if she wanted John, she'd better back off. She implied that John still had feelings for her. Sherry, shaken, confided in her family. She told her father she was worried about Stephanie. She felt unsafe. Her father later recalled warning John, "This woman is dangerous. She's a cop. If anything ever happens to Sherry, look at Stephanie first." That warning, tragically, would prove prophetic. Because within months of that confrontation, Sherry Rasmussen would be dead, and the case would be written off as a random burglary gone wrong. But buried inside that crime scene, overlooked for 2 decades, was a piece of evidence that would one day reveal the horrifying truth. And when that day came, the badge Stephanie Lazarus wore so proudly wouldn't protect her. It would damn her. It was February 24th, 1986, a Monday. The kind of day that starts ordinary, almost boring, but ends up carved into history. Sherry Rasmussen's husband, John, left their condo for work early that morning. The two had shared breakfast together, exchanged the usual goodbyes. Sherry had thought about skipping work herself. She was still adjusting to married life, balancing the long hours of hospital administration with the domestic routines of being newlywed. By mid-morning, she called her mother. She mentioned she wasn't feeling great. Maybe she'd stay home. She also repeated the same worry she'd voiced before. She was uneasy about one of John's old girlfriends, Stephanie. Her mother told her not to worry, but Sherry couldn't shake it. That was the last time her family heard her voice. When John came home that evening, nothing was as it should have been. The garage showed signs of forced entry. The living room was in chaos, furniture overturned, signs of a violent struggle. And in the bedroom, he found Sherry. She had been brutally beaten, her body covered in defensive wounds. She had fought desperately for her life. But it hadn't been enough. Sherry had also been shot 3 times in the chest. The scene was staged to look like a burglary. Electronics scattered, jewelry boxes dumped, valuables missing. But something about it didn't fit. Why would burglars stay long enough to beat a victim this savagely? Why kill her execution style after the struggle? And why did they leave behind valuables worth thousands? Detectives arrived quickly, cataloging the scene. The official theory came almost immediately. This was a burglary gone wrong. Los Angeles in the 1980s was drowning in break-ins. It was a convenient explanation. The evidence that suggested otherwise, the intensity of the fight, the signs of personal rage, was brushed aside. Even more telling, a bite mark was found on Sherry's arm. Forensics gathered a swab from it. In 1986, DNA testing was primitive, almost non-existent in police work. But that bite mark held the truth. It just needed time. From the very beginning, Sherry's family was unconvinced. Her father, Nels Rasmussen, pressed the LAPD. He told them directly, "Look at Stephanie Lazarus. She threatened my daughter. She had motive." But his pleas went nowhere. Why? Because Lazarus was one of their own. She wore the same badge, carried the same authority, and was well liked in the department. To suggest she was capable of murder was, to her colleagues, unthinkable. The burglary explanation was easier, cleaner, and the case was filed away as unsolved. For Stephanie Lazarus, life didn't just return to normal, it flourished. She stayed with the LAPD, advancing her career. She specialized in art theft, a prestigious division that often dealt with high-profile cases and wealthy collectors. Colleagues admired her tenacity. She seemed tireless, dedicated. She was even commended for her work, earning promotions. Behind the badge, though, she carried the weight of what she had done. Imagine the psychology. Every morning she put on her uniform. Every time she stepped into a crime scene. Every time she shook a colleague's hand. She knew that she had killed a woman in cold blood, and she knew the department had buried it. For years, she lived with the impossible balance, detective and murderer, hunter and hunted. And for 2 decades, it worked. Sherry's case collected dust in a box. Her family begged for answers, but were dismissed. The evidence, the bite mark swab, sat in a freezer. But time changes everything, because by the early 2000s, DNA technology had advanced. Old cases were being reopened. Evidence that once seemed meaningless was now a ticking time bomb. And buried in the LAPD's archives was a secret that, once unlocked, would turn their own department upside down. For years, Sherry Rasmussen's murder file sat in a drawer at LAPD headquarters. Occasionally, a detective might skim through it, shake their head, and move on. Burglary gone wrong cases were common, and this one seemed no different on paper. But to Sherry's family, the explanation never felt right. Her father, Nels, became relentless. He wrote letters to the LAPD, called detectives, even spoke to supervisors. Every time he said the same name, Stephanie Lazarus, and every time he was dismissed. Police suggested Nels was simply grieving, unable to accept the randomness of crime. They told him not to chase shadows. But Nels wasn't chasing shadows. He was pointing at the truth. While the Rasmussens grieved, Stephanie Lazarus thrived. She became a fixture in the LAPD art theft division. She rubbed shoulders with curators, tracked stolen paintings, and gained a reputation as a specialist in cases few understood. She traveled, lectured, even appeared in the media as an expert. To the outside world, she was the model of success, a respected detective, a woman in a male-dominated force who had carved her way to the top. But underneath that polished career was a secret waiting to surface. It started with a bite. Back in 1986, when Sherry was killed, detectives had collected a swab from the bite mark on her arm. At the time, they couldn't do much with it. But in the 1990s and early 2000s, forensic DNA testing exploded. Cold cases across America were being reopened, solved with evidence long thought useless. By 2004, LAPD had begun reviewing unsolved murders. And in the files of Sherry Rasmussen's case, the bite mark sample waited. When it was finally tested, the results were stunning. The DNA didn't point to a man, as many had assumed. It pointed to a woman. That single revelation shifted the entire case. Burglars in 1986 Los Angeles were overwhelmingly male. Random break-ins, violent or not, rarely involved women. A female suspect narrowed the field dramatically. And when detectives started asking the simple question, who had a motive? The answer was almost too obvious. Sherry's family had been saying it for decades. Her father's warnings echoed in old notes. The jealous ex-girlfriend. The police officer who had confronted Sherry face to face. Stephanie Lazarus. The cold case unit didn't leap immediately to arrest her. This was sensitive. They were investigating one of their own, someone with decades of service and deep connections in the department. If word leaked too early, the entire inquiry could collapse. Instead, they began quietly piecing together a timeline. Where was Stephanie the day of the murder? What was her relationship to John Ruetten at the time? Did she ever have access to Sherry? The answers all pointed in one direction. But suspicion wasn't enough. They needed proof. And getting that proof against a seasoned LAPD detective who knew investigative tactics inside and out would take precision and patience. For 2 decades, Stephanie Lazarus had walked freely, convinced she'd beaten the system. She had hidden in plain sight, building her career while Sherry's family suffered. But DNA had changed the game. The bite mark was no longer just a scar on Sherry's body. It was a fingerprint pointing directly at her killer. And it was only a matter of time before that fingerprint led investigators to knock on the door of Detective Lazarus herself. The detectives handling Sherry Rasmussen's cold case knew they were playing with fire. They weren't dealing with a typical suspect. This was a sworn LAPD detective, armed, trained, and connected. If Lazarus caught wind she was under investigation, she could destroy evidence, manipulate colleagues, or worse. So they worked in silence. No leaks, no chatter in the hallways. Only a handful of trusted investigators even knew her name had surfaced. Every move had to be calculated. By the mid-2000s, Lazarus was still thriving in her career. She was respected, social, and active. She went to the gym regularly, ate out at restaurants, and lived an ordinary detective's life. To investigators, this ordinary routine was an opportunity. They needed her DNA, but they couldn't tip her off by asking. So they shadowed her, waiting for the right moment. The break came in the simplest way imaginable. One afternoon, Lazarus stopped for coffee. She drank, tossed the cup into the trash, and left. That discarded cup was gold. Forensic technicians rushed it to the lab, extracting DNA from her saliva. Then they ran the comparison against the bite mark swab preserved since 1986. The results came back quickly. It was a match. The detective stared at the report, stunned. The evidence was no longer circumstantial, no longer theoretical. Science had stripped away every excuse. The bite mark on Sherry Rasmussen's arm had been made by Detective Stephanie Lazarus. The woman who investigated crimes, who wore the uniform, who swore an oath to protect. She had murdered out of jealousy, then buried the crime beneath her badge for more than 20 years. What do you do when you discover one of your own is a killer? The investigators wrestled with it. If they moved too soon, she could flee or retaliate. If they waited too long, she could sense the noose tightening. But there was no denying it anymore. Stephanie Lazarus was the prime suspect in the brutal killing of Sherry Rasmussen. Now they needed to figure out how to bring her in without giving her a chance to fight back. For more than 2 decades, she had lived as both detective and murderer, hunter and hunted. But the DNA had exposed the lie. And soon, the LAPD would face an impossible moment: to walk into their own department and arrest one of their own. The murder of Sherry Rasmussen looked, at first glance, like a tragic accident of circumstance. Detectives in 1986 saw the ransacked condo, the missing electronics, the broken glass, and reached a conclusion that was quick, convenient, and wrong. A burglary gone wrong. It was a narrative that fit the city at the time. Los Angeles was in the middle of a crime wave. Break-ins were skyrocketing, and violent burglaries weren't rare. But anyone who looked closely at the crime scene would have seen something else, something darker. Sherry hadn't been a passive victim. She fought like hell. Her body told the story. Defensive wounds across her arms, bruises, scratches. She had been beaten with the butt of a gun, her face swollen and bloodied. Furniture was knocked over, glass shattered. The condo bore the scars of a violent, desperate struggle. And yet, the supposed burglars left valuables untouched. Thousands of dollars in jewelry and electronics remained. This wasn't the chaos of opportunistic thieves. This was rage, personal, intimate rage. The strangest detail was the bite. On Sherry's forearm, deep impressions of human teeth were visible. It wasn't just an act of violence, it was an act of dominance. Criminal profilers would later say, biting is personal. It's not about killing. It's about control, humiliation, and anger. Whoever killed Sherry wasn't just trying to silence her. They wanted her to suffer. Despite these contradictions, detectives leaned into the burglary theory. 2 suspects, they said, likely interrupted by Sherry when she came home. A struggle broke out, shots were fired, and the burglars fled. Case closed. Neat. Simple. Except it wasn't true. From the moment they heard the burglary gone wrong theory, Sherry's parents knew something was wrong. Her father, Nels, told anyone who would listen. This wasn't random. She told us she was being threatened. Her mother cried to detectives. She said she was scared. She said she was worried about John's ex. But the badge carried weight. Stephanie Lazarus wasn't just any ex-girlfriend. She was LAPD. Suggesting she could be involved was unthinkable to the very people who worked beside her. The family's pleas were dismissed as grief-driven paranoia. Meanwhile, Lazarus carried on with her life. She grieved publicly with John, offering condolences, even support. To outsiders, she looked like the dutiful friend, the concerned colleague. But in private, John distanced himself. He remarried years later, moved forward. Yet the shadow of Sherry's death lingered. Stephanie, too, moved on. She threw herself into work, rising steadily in the LAPD ranks. She became part of elite units, handling high-value cases. It was almost as if solving other people's crimes helped her bury her own. As the months turned to years, Sherry's murder slipped into the background. New crimes demanded attention. New tragedies consumed detectives' time. Files piled up in evidence rooms, cold cases stacking one after another. By the mid-1990s, Sherry's case was practically forgotten, except by her family. Nels Rasmussen kept pushing, writing letters, asking questions. He never let it rest. But inside LAPD, the case was just one of hundreds gathering dust. Or so it seemed. Because while the world moved on, the evidence didn't. The bite mark swab, carefully preserved, sat waiting in a freezer, silent, untouched. And when science caught up, that small, forgotten sample would scream the truth louder than any witness could. In the years following Sherry Rasmussen's murder, Stephanie Lazarus crafted an image of success. She wasn't just another detective, she was an insider. She joined specialized divisions, excelled in assignments, and built a reputation for reliability. Colleagues described her as disciplined, smart, and above all, trustworthy. To them, she was a protector, a guardian, not a killer. And that was the genius of her disguise. Who would ever suspect the detective of the very crime she was supposed to fight? The culture of the LAPD in the 1980s and 1990s made Lazarus's deception easier. It was a department struggling with its own scandals: Rodney King, Rampart, corruption probes. The last thing leadership wanted was a scandal from within their own homicide ranks. Accusing a fellow officer wasn't just difficult, it was dangerous. Careers could be ruined, reputations destroyed. So when Nels Rasmussen said, "Look at Lazarus," the system closed ranks. It wasn't just disbelief, it was willful blindness. Ironically, Lazarus specialized in the very work that should have exposed her. By the 1990s, she became part of the art theft detail, an elite unit that investigated multi-million-dollar heists. She handled high-profile cases, spoke at conferences, even lectured on criminal behavior. She analyzed how thieves covered their tracks. She taught younger detectives how to spot deception. All the while, she was the best liar in the room. While Lazarus thrived, the Rasmussen family suffered. Nels never stopped writing letters to LAPD brass. He pleaded for the case to be re-examined. He reminded them of Stephanie's threats, Sherry's fears. Years passed. Responses were polite, but dismissive. Still, he refused to let his daughter's memory be reduced to a dusty file. In interviews later, Nels would say, "I just couldn't let it go. I knew who killed my daughter. I just needed them to listen. By the early 2000s, forensic science had transformed. DNA wasn't just a tool, it was revolutionizing cold cases nationwide. Evidence once thought useless was suddenly explosive. And in storage, waiting like a time capsule, was the bite mark swab from Sherry Rasmussen's body. When it was tested, the revelation was immediate. The killer wasn't male. The DNA belonged to a woman. It was the crack in Lazarus's armor. The cold case detectives now had something powerful, science pointing them in a new direction. But they also had a problem. How do you investigate a decorated colleague without tipping her off? They started quietly reviewing Lazarus's history, her connection to John, her confrontations with Sherry, the warnings from Sherry's family. One by one, the puzzle pieces clicked together. Every path circled back to Lazarus. For over 20 years, Lazarus had lived free, confident the crime was buried. But now, her past was catching up. The DNA pointed to her. The motive pointed to her. The family's testimony pointed to her. And detectives began to realize the truth. The woman who stood beside them in the halls of LAPD headquarters was the very murderer they'd been hunting all along. But knowing wasn't enough. To make a case airtight, they needed undeniable proof. They needed Lazarus's DNA, collected secretly, compared scientifically, and matched without question. And to get it, they'd have to outsmart one of their own. Detectives knew they were treading on dangerous ground. This wasn't just any suspect. This was a fellow officer, a seasoned detective, a woman who had trained others on how to spot surveillance, how to detect tails. Following Lazarus would require precision. One mistake, one suspicious glance, and she could tip off the entire department. So, the cold case unit went quiet. No leaks, no chatter. Every move kept in the smallest possible circle. They watched her daily routines. She lived in Simi Valley, a comfortable suburb outside Los Angeles. She drove to work, she hit the gym, she shopped at local stores. To neighbors, she was a respectable, middle-aged woman, a mother, a professional. But to the detectives in the unmarked cars, every latte, every trash bag, every sip from a water bottle was an opportunity. Because what they needed now wasn't circumstantial evidence. It was her DNA. The opportunity came quietly. Lazarus stopped for a coffee, just another morning on her way to work. She sipped, tossed the cup into the trash, and walked away. To her, it was nothing. To the detectives, it was everything. The cup was retrieved, bagged, and rushed to the lab. Inside that flimsy paper cup, history waited to be rewritten. Forensic scientists compared the sample against the decades-old bite mark swab. It wasn't a quick test. There were sleepless nights, nervous pacing. Detectives who had carried the Rasmussen case file for months, some for years, knew that if the DNA didn't match, they were back to square one. But if it did, it would mean the unimaginable, that a sworn protector of the law was a cold-blooded killer. The results came in. The DNA from the coffee cup matched the DNA from the bite mark. There was no ambiguity, no statistical fluke, no other explanation. Stephanie Lazarus wasn't just a suspect, she was the killer. The case, buried for more than 2 decades, had just exploded open. When word spread quietly through the tight circle of investigators, reactions were visceral. Some were furious. How could one of our own do this? Others were sickened. "She's been walking these halls for years." But all agreed they couldn't let her know what was coming, because now the mission shifted. They had to arrest Lazarus, and to do it safely, they'd have to plan it like an operation against a dangerous fugitive, because that's exactly what she was. For the first time in decades, justice for Sherry Rasmussen was within reach. But the question loomed: how do you confront a veteran LAPD detective trained in weapons, tactics, and deception without giving her a chance to fight back? The answer would come in the form of an elaborate sting inside her own department. Once the DNA confirmed Lazarus as Sherry Rasmussen's killer, the cold case detectives faced a chilling reality. How do you arrest a cop who knows every tactic in the book? They couldn't risk confronting her on the street. They couldn't show up at her house. She was armed, trained, and likely to resist. Instead, they devised something audacious: lure her into her own workplace under the guise of routine business and spring the trap from within LAPD headquarters itself. It would be the safest place to catch her off guard, because she'd never expected. Detectives approached Lazarus casually. They told her another officer needed her insight on a case. Nothing unusual. She'd done this kind of consultation hundreds of times. Lazarus agreed, unsuspecting. She followed them down the sterile corridors of the very building she had called home for decades. But instead of heading to a colleague's office, she was guided into a secure interrogation room. The door clicked shut. At first, the conversation was calm. The detectives asked her about cold cases, old contacts, the kind of professional banter she was used to. Then, slowly, they shifted the subject. They asked about John Rutan, about his marriage to Sherry Rasmussen, about the time period in 1986. Lazarus stiffened. She tried to play it off. Oh, that was a long time ago. But she was seasoned enough to sense the danger. When detectives pressed harder, Lazarus's veneer cracked. Her voice faltered. She stammered. She tried to deflect. "If you're accusing me, maybe I should get a lawyer." It was the first time in her career that she was on the other side of the table. And in that moment, she realized what was happening. The murder she thought she had buried in 1986 had come back, wrapped in DNA, to destroy her. The detectives didn't hesitate. They told Lazarus she was under arrest for the murder of Sherry Rasmussen. In a building filled with officers she once considered peers, Lazarus was cuffed and escorted out, no longer a detective, but a suspect. Her colleagues watched in disbelief. Some couldn't even look at her. Others shook their heads in quiet rage. For decades, she had worn the badge of trust. Now she wore the shackles of justice. When news reached the Rasmussen family, emotions collided: relief, shock, vindication. For years, Nels Rasmussen had begged LAPD to take a closer look. For years, he had been dismissed. Now, the arrest was proof that he had been right all along. Proof that his daughter's life mattered. But it also reopened wounds. Sherry was still gone. Justice was coming late. Far too late. Stephanie Lazarus had lived free for over 2 decades, hiding in plain sight as a decorated LAPD detective. Now, with DNA evidence stacked against her, she faced the trial of her life. And as prosecutors prepared their case, one question lingered in the air. How does a jury process the idea that a cop, a sworn protector, was in fact a murderer? When the news broke that a veteran LAPD detective had been arrested for a decades-old murder, Los Angeles was stunned. Headlines screamed, "Cop charged in cold case murder." "Detective arrested in love triangle killing." For the public, it was unthinkable. For LAPD, it was humiliating. A scandal that cut to the heart of trust between the department and the city it served. And for the Rasmussen family, it was the moment they had been waiting decades to see: the possibility of justice. The prosecution painted Lazarus as a woman consumed by jealousy, unable to let go of her past relationship with John Ruetten. They laid out the timeline: Lazarus, furious over John's marriage; Sherry's fears and warnings to her family; Lazarus's confrontations with Sherry; the brutal murder staged as a burglary gone wrong; and then, the nail in the coffin, the DNA match. The bite mark on Sherry Rasmussen's body had waited more than 2 decades to speak. Now it screamed Lazarus's guilt. The defense fought back with everything they had. They argued the investigation was flawed, that evidence had been mishandled, that memories from 1986 were unreliable. They painted Lazarus as a scapegoat, a convenient target to close a cold case in a department desperate for redemption. But no matter how hard they pushed, the DNA stood unshaken. Science didn't forget. Science didn't lie. The courtroom heard from Sherry's family. Nels Rasmussen took the stand, his voice cracking as he recalled warning detectives about Lazarus back in 1986. I told them to look at her, but no one listened. Jurors also heard from John Ruetten. He admitted his past with Lazarus, but described his shock at learning the woman he once dated had murdered his wife. The testimony was devastating. It gave the jury not just facts, but faces. Not just evidence, but heartbreak. Throughout the trial, Lazarus sat stone-faced at the defense table. Some said she looked like a detective studying a case file, detached and analytical. Others said she looked like a woman haunted, struggling to maintain composure as the walls closed in. But she never admitted guilt. She never apologized. For her, it seemed the badge still offered a shield, even in a courtroom where the truth was stripping it away. The prosecution's closing words hit like a hammer. This was not a burglary gone wrong. This was an execution of rage, a murder committed by someone sworn to uphold the law. Sherry Rasmussen deserved better. Her family deserved better. And the people of Los Angeles deserved justice. The defense countered with doubt, urging jurors not to convict based on emotion. But by then, the story had already taken hold. The jealous detective, the silenced wife, the DNA that refused to be buried. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent. Every breath seemed to pause. We, the jury, find the defendant, Stephanie Lazarus, guilty of first-degree murder. Gasps echoed. Sherry's family clutched each other, tears streaming down their faces. Lazarus sat motionless, her career, her freedom, her double life all collapsing in a single word: guilty. The judge delivered the sentence: 27 years to life in prison. For the Rasmussen family, it wasn't enough to replace what was lost, but it was justice, long delayed but finally delivered. For LAPD, it was a stain that would never fully wash away, a reminder that even those sworn to uphold the law could be capable of the worst betrayal. When the guilty verdict was read, Nels Rasmussen closed his eyes. For 23 years, he had carried the weight of his daughter's murder. He had written letters, made calls, pleaded with anyone who would listen. Now, finally, The system that had once failed him delivered the justice he had begged for. But victory came bittersweet. Sherry was still gone. No sentence, no guilty verdict could bring back her laughter, her plans, her future. For the Rasmussen family, justice was real, but closure would always remain elusive. Inside the Los Angeles Police Department, the Lazarus case was more than a scandal. It was a mirror. It revealed how warnings from victims' families had been ignored, how suspicions about one of their own had been brushed aside, how the thin blue line had become a shield, protecting not just good cops, but killers. For many officers, it was devastating. To realize a colleague they respected had been living a lie. To admit that the culture of silence had allowed her to get away with murder for decades. It wasn't just Lazarus on trial, it was the institution itself. When the story hit the media, the reaction was explosive. Talk shows dissected every detail. True crime outlets called it one of the most shocking cases of betrayal in modern policing. Communities already distrustful of LAPD saw it as proof that the system was broken. A detective committing murder and hiding behind the badge was the stuff of nightmares. And now, it was real. The Lazarus case became shorthand for corruption, cover-ups, and the price of loyalty gone too far. Stephanie Lazarus went from detective's badge to prison jumpsuit. She entered the California Institution for Women, stripped of her titles, her gun, her authority. For years, she had walked into courtrooms as an investigator. Now, she was the investigated. A cautionary tale for every inmate who whispered her name. Some say she adjusted quickly, slipping into routines like she once did on the job. Others say she never stopped protesting, never admitted guilt, clinging to the story that she was framed. But whether she accepted it or not, the truth was carved in stone. DNA had exposed her, and the justice system had caged her. For all the talk of Lazarus, the real legacy belonged to Sherry Rasmussen, a young woman full of promise, cut down in her prime. A victim whose story refused to stay silent. A name that forced LAPD to face its failures. Her father's persistence, her mother's grief, her sister's pain. They kept her memory alive long enough for science to catch up. And in the end, it was Sherry's voice, through that bite mark, through the DNA, that spoke louder than Lazarus's lies. The Lazarus case stands as one of the most haunting reminders in true crime. Sometimes, the killer isn't a shadow in the night. Sometimes the killer wears a badge, carries a gun, and earns the trust of an entire city. It asks the hardest questions. How many other warnings have been ignored? How many cases were dismissed because the suspect was one of us? And how can the public trust a system that once protected a murderer in its own ranks? For Los Angeles, the case left scars. For the Rasmussen family, it left an empty seat at the table. For the world, it left a chilling truth. Even those sworn to protect can be the ones we need protection from. What do you think? If your loved one was warning about someone, especially a police officer, do you think the system would listen? Or would it take decades, like it did for Sherry, for the truth to finally surface? Drop your thoughts below. Let's talk about it. And remember, every case, every story, is about more than just crime. It's about people, about lives, and about the pursuit of justice, no matter how long it takes.